What's going on, guys? How are you doing today? It's Aziz here with Primus Learning, and we are going to be discussing about AWS EC2. In the previous section, we looked at AWS VPCs, we have looked at S3, and we have looked at AWS IAM. So without further ado, let's dive in to see exactly what EC2 is all about. So what exactly is AWS EC2? AWS EC2 is basically a service that we can use in AWS to be able to create our virtual machines. We can also be able to create our load balancers. We can also be able to create auto-scaling groups and every other thing that has to do with compute. So, but before we dive right deep into EC2, let's first of all understand what virtualization is all about. What is virtualization? What are virtual machines? And what exactly are hypervisors? So, virtualization is a concept that helps us to be able to create virtual machines from a single physical machine. Say, for example, we have this virtual machine that has 6 CPUs. We have 500 gigabytes in storage and we have 16 gigabytes in memory. From this machine, we can be able to create other machines that can have, for example, we can create a machine that has 2 CPUs, has 100 gigabytes of storage and has 4 gigabytes of memory. So basically, we can do this by the use of what we call a hypervisor. Okay, so virtualization is enabled by the use of what we call a hypervisor. For example, in your machine, you can use something like VirtualBox to be able to enable virtualization. And then in your Oracle VirtualBox, you can then be able to create your multiple virtual machines. When you're creating your virtual machines, you always give the configuration, the hardware configuration of exactly how the virtual machine is going to look like. Then on top of that, now you can be able to install your guest operating system. So the operating system of the physical hardware is called the host operating system, and that of your virtual machine is called the guest operating system. And on top of our guest operating system, now we can be able to install all our other applications that we want to install in the system. So this is basically what virtualization is all about. Virtualization just gives us that opportunity to be able to create virtual machines from our single physical machine. And this is the concept that cloud providers are using to be able to provide us virtual machines today. So the only difference is that cloud providers are doing it at a larger scale, right? So now, how exactly does EC2 use this concept to be able to give you virtual machines? So when you're working with AWS EC2, we have the concept of what we call EC2. So we're talking about AWS EC2. When you're working with AWS EC2, we have what we call EC2 instances. So an EC2 instance is basically just a virtual machine that you create in AWS Cloud. And when you're creating your EC2 instance, there are a couple of things that we need to take into consideration. First, we have what we call the instance type. What exactly is the EC2 instance type? The EC2 instance type is just the hardware configuration that you want to give to your EC2 instance. And how does this work? Generally, it's in the form, the instance, you have what we call the instance family. And then you have what we call the generation. And then you have a dot, and then you have the size of the EC2 instance. For example, you can have an instance type that is called a T2.micro. So the T here is for the instance family. The 2 here is for the generation, and the micro here is for the size of this particular instance. So you have the instance family, then you have the generation, and then you have the size of the EC2 instance. Why exactly is AWS doing it this way? The reason is because AWS has given the various capacity configurations depending on what type of workload you might want to use with the EC2 instance. For example, if you have just general purpose workload, which means you have applications that are maybe just you need the same number of memory and CPU, then you can go for the general purpose family, right? If you want something that is more compute optimized, which means you need lots of CPU, then you can go for a compute optimized family, right? And when you go on that particular family, you're going to see the various configurations that you can have as concerns with memory, with storage, and with your CPU configurations. So this is what EC2 instance types are all about. Now, when you have decided what instance type that you want to use based on the application that you're going to be running, the next thing that you need to decide is what operating system am I going to be running in this particular virtual machine. And in AWS, this operating system is what we call the AMI, which stands for Amazon Machine Image. So the Amazon Machine Image is just is just the operating system that you want to use with your virtual machine. And there are multiple types of AMIs. You have the Amazon Linux AMI, you have the Linux, and then you have the CentOS, you have the Red Hat, you have the Ubuntu virtual, you have the Ubuntu AMIs, and so on. So that is what the AMI is all about. So now, after you have decided your instance type and your AMI that you want to use with your virtual machine, the next important thing is the storage. When working with AWS EC2, you can be able to decide which volume you're going to be able to use with your EC2 instance. So by volume, we mean the storage. And by default with AWS EC2, you're going to have what we call the AWS EC2 instance store. What exactly is AWS EC2 instance store? The instance store is a volatile storage that is going to be attached to your EC2 instance. But the idea is that with the instance store, if you delete your virtual machine or if you stop your virtual machine, you're going to lose the data that you have in your instance store. But if you want to be able to persist your data, then you can use what we call an elastic block storage, AWS EBS. We're going to have a different chapter where we talk extensively about AWS EBS volumes and all the various offerings for AWS EBS. After you create your EC2 instance, when you're creating your EC2 instance, you can also be able to create what we call a security group. As we saw when we discussed about VPCs, how can you be able to configure security at the level of your instances? By using what we call security groups. So security groups are what you can be able to use to define inbound traffic and outbound traffic. Who is going to be able to connect to your virtual machine and who cannot be able to connect to your virtual machine. So this is what security groups are all about. When working with AWS EC2, how exactly does the pricing work? You have different pricing models when it comes to AWS EC2. First, we have what we call the on-demand pricing model. Then you have what we call reserved capacity. And you can also have what we call spot instances. And then you can also have what we call dedicated hosting. So how exactly does it work when it comes to on-demand? So on-demand basically is the pay-as-you-go pricing model, where you're going to be paying, where you're going to be billed hourly for using the various EC2 instances. And generally, when you're using on-demand, it's usually when you don't know exactly if you want to be able to reserve, right? You don't want to commit to the instances because you don't know exactly how your workload is going to look like at first. So, but with reserved instances, you can be able to save up at least 72% or 70% on-demand pricing. But with this, you need to commit to at least from 1 to 3 years to the particular virtual machine that you want to use. Then with spot instances, basically it's just capacity that is lying around, and you can be able to place a spot price. And then if your spot price matches the particular the price in the market, then AWS can be able to give you the virtual machine, so you can use the virtual machine. With spot instances, they are more optimal for when you're doing your development environment, in your testing environments, where if the virtual machine is stopped, then you're not going to have any issues. With dedicated capacity, AWS is going to dedicate you the physical server itself, and then you can go ahead and do your configuration exactly how you want to do it. So that is what dedicated instances are all about. And spot instances, you provide a spot price, and then you can be able to get the virtual machine if the price matches what you propose. And then you have reserved capacity, where you can be able to commit to 1 to 3 years for the virtual machine. After we create our EC2 instances in the AWS cloud, how can we be able to connect to our virtual machines? We can be able to connect to our virtual machines over SSH. So how exactly does this work? When you're creating your EC2 instances, you're going to create what we call a private key and a public key. And then the public key is going to be stored in the server, and then the private key is going to be downloaded into your system. And after the virtual machine is created, you can then be able to connect to the virtual machine over the SSH protocol. So that is it for today, and I'll see you in the next lecture, where we're going to look at the hands-on on how to work with AWS EC2. Bye.